Turn with me, if you would, this morning to Ruth chapter 1. Ruth chapter 1. Take a look at what it says, verse 1. And we're going to read a few verses, kind of go through them, read a few verses, go through them. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion." Kind of cool names there, by the way. "They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They then took Moabite women. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." Let's kind of go through this section, because this is an introduction to what's going to be happening through the rest of the story. First of all, we see that this was taking place during the time of the judges. We get the setting of this story. The setting of the plot of this story is founded during the time of the judges. Let me explain what that is. In fact, if you go back one page to the book of Judges, the last verse in the book of Judges gives us basically a summary of the entire book. The judges were a period of about 400 years after the people of Israel, people of God came into Israel. They set themselves up a nation. Joshua conquers the land. And then for 400 years, there is no king. God is their king until Saul is then crowned king. Saul is anointed king. There's about a 400-year period, and this is called the time of the judges. But what happens in that time of the judges is very telling. Take a look at chapter 21, Judges 21, verse 25. Last verse of the book of Judges. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." The people of Israel come into the land, the promised land, and what do? They did what was right in their own eyes. By the way, we talk about in our world this idea of relativism. Right here you see relativism. Right? We talk about relativism in our world today. This is relativism. Everybody doing whatever they think is right. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And that's the baloney of relativism. And baloney is not a good thing here. Not deer baloney, some bad baloney. All right? Right? This is the baloney of our world. Right? We have this idea. We live in this world today. This is no different than even the people of God lived. They did what was right in their own eyes. Whatever truth is for you, it is. Whatever truth is for me, it is. Which is contrary to the scriptures. That truth is founded in Christ. Truth is founded in his word. Here it says they did what was right in their own eyes. We see the story of Ruth founded in that setting. And what you find, if you were to read the book of Judges, we can summarize it very quickly, 400 years, very quickly, with a cycle. They lived in a cycle. Let me explain the cycle, which will explain all the book of Judges. First of all, they would sin against God. They would do what was right in their own eyes. God will respond because that's his children, and he would respond in judgment. And what he would do is he would send a foreign nation into the land to conquer them. So if you remember the story in the book of Judges, we see the Moabites being one of them. We see the Philistines. Anyone remember the judge that was raised up after the Philistines? His name was Samson. Right? We see the Moabites. There was King Eglon. That's one of my favorite stories. I remember as a kid reading that, I thought the Bible was so cool. King Eglon, it says, was a fat king. He was sitting in his cool chamber, which was actually in his bathroom. Archaeologists have found that's called the cool chamber. And the judge, Ehud was his name, snuck his way into the bathroom while he was in there and stabbed him in the stomach. And it says he was so fat that the entrails came out. They couldn't even see the handle of the knife. Great story, action story. By the way, just a little insight into archaeology. It says he escaped and the door was still locked from the inside. So how did he escape? Through the toilet. Kind of cool story there. Some of you are like, I'm reading the book of Judges. Maybe you're looking over at your wife and you're like, man, I'm reading the Bible this week, honey. I'm going to read the book of Judges. There's some great stories in there. That was the Moabites. So what they would do is they would sin. God would raise up a foreign nation. They would come in and God would be judging them. Right? Then what would the people of God do? The people of God would get on their faces and they cry out and say, God, have mercy on us. We're in distress. We're under persecution. God, where are you? You made a promise to Abraham. You made a promise to Moses. Will you keep your promise? And what did God do? God, in his mercy and in his grace, responds and sends a judge to deliver them. And the judge would usually come forth, a warrior like Deborah, who would come forth and deliver the people. And what you find over 400 years is this cycle continuing over and over and over and over and over again. If you read the book of Judges, the overwhelming thing at the end of every story of the judge is, and there was peace in the land, but then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And it continues over and over. Doesn't that sound like our lives sometimes? Right. Then don't we find ourselves in sometimes these same type of cycles? Like there's nothing new under the sun, Solomon says. We find ourselves in the same cycles. We sin before God. We then cry out for mercy because we feel the judgment of God or we feel the discipline of God. And we're like, God, deliver me. Be merciful to me. I'm so sorry. Right? And we're like the kid that keeps coming saying sorry to our parents, to the parent. And we're like, this is the 20th time. Maybe you ought to not do it anymore. Get it? And what do? We say that, God, forgive me. And what does God do? In his mercy and grace, he delivers. In mercy and grace, he responds. And then we have peace. And what happens? We fall right back in the cycle. Some of you are living there now. You're in the cycle. You're in the cycle. That is the story of the book of Ruth. It is in the time of the judges. And what we find is in the middle of that chaos is a story of hope. We don't know when it happened during that time. Many believe it happened toward the end of the book of Judges. But we don't know when it happened. But this story of Ruth is meant to be a story of integrity and righteousness in a period of rebellion and immorality. Because if you read the book of Judges, you think from all outward appearance, God's purposes and righteousness have failed. The book of Ruth reminds us that behind the scenes, God is doing something in the midst of the chaos. Folks, when we look at our world, you look at your life, you look at your situation, you wonder, God, where are you? The facts say this. When we begin to see the meaning behind what's happening, when we begin to understand the meaning behind it, then we have truth. And we see that behind the scenes in the book of Judges, God is at work. And the story of Ruth reminds us that he is at work to redeem people to himself. Take a look at what else it says. So here we are in the land of Judges, and there was a what? A famine in the land. Now, this is pretty powerful. Because what we find is whenever you see this idea of famine being in the land of Israel, almost every time it's related to the judgment of God. And I believe here it's related to that. And I'm going to show you why as we go through this. You're going to see this seems evident that this was from God's hand. In fact, Leviticus 26 says this about Israel's lack of obedience, how God would judge them. In Leviticus 26, God told them, if you walk in my statutes and you observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase. Here's what God was saying. Your agricultural and societal abundance is going to be dependent upon your spiritual obedience. Your physical abundance will be dependent, he told the Jews, will be dependent upon your spiritual obedience. So, you don't obey God's laws, you don't follow what he called you to do, there will be a spiritual famine that will lead to a physical famine. So, here we find the land flowing with milk and honey, parched and dry. The land that provided for them mighty things was now in famine. There was no food. It was a desperate situation. In fact, there is irony all through the book of Ruth. Let me show you the first picture of irony here. And there was a man of what city? Bethlehem in Judah. And the word Bethlehem, anybody know what that means? It literally means house of bread. Beth, house, lachem. Got to spit when you say that. Bread, house of bread. Do you see the irony? The house of bread wasn't providing bread. Bethlehem was an insignificant city in their day, but what it was known for was its wheat fields and its pastures for shepherds. And so there they had a lot of bread. They provided bread. It was known as the house of bread, and there were some reasons for that along with the Lord. In fact, Bethlehem was where they got the bread for the temple, for the tabernacle. It was from Bethlehem, was one of the places where they were provided the showbread. Bethlehem, house of bread, was now in famine. Place of abundance, now impoverished. Place of blessing, now dried up and cursed. So you can imagine what God is saying here. Panera Bread has run out of bread. Bethlehem Bread Company is no longer providing bread. Desperate situation. And clearly the scripture makes clear it's from the hand of God. A place filled with food was now starving. And then we get an introduction to the characters. Take a look at verse 2. It says, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, in their day, names had meanings, and I want to define for you because we're going to see these characters, some of these characters throughout the entire story, and some of them are going to end very quickly. But what we find is there are names which had great meaning. In their day, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. That was talking about the name. God gave them a name. First of all, Elimelech. His name means, my God, the King. Or my God is king. This idea that his name meant that God reigns. Now, what does he do in this moment? There's dry land. He makes a decision to move his family to the land of Moab. Is God king? He didn't show that. Naomi has an interesting name. Naomi, or Naomi, literally means sweet, pleasant, precious, sweetie pie, baby love. It's a pet name, actually. Kind of has the idea of like Buttercup. Hey, Buttercup, you sweet, sweet thing, right? Maybe you have a pet name for your wife. My pet name for my wife is Baby Love. I call her Baby Love. You know, in moments of endearment, you know what I'm talking about, guys. You walk in the kitchen and you look at her and you're like, hey, Baby Love, what's up? How you doing? How you doing today? You take her into your arms. That's my pet name for her, Baby Love. That's the name here. Naomi is actually kind of a pet name, meaning sweetness, sweetie pie, sweetheart, precious. That's the name here. That's what it means. Sorry, I had to go Lord of the Rings on this. The Hobbit's coming out. So, then we have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, as much as some of you Trekkie fans out there are like, man, I love those names. That's great. Don't name your son these names. Here's why. What they mean is Mahlon, which means sick, and Chilion, which means dead. If you name your son Chilion, it doesn't mean he's chilling around. It means he's dead, all right? You don't name your sons Mahlon and Chilion. Sick and dead. I think this is going to reveal to us a little bit of the story here of what's going to happen, right? And the irony, folks, the irony of the book of Ruth is huge. Think about the irony here. Elimelech, my God is king. I'm going to run from the land of Israel. Notice what happens. So this famine comes into the land. Go back to verse 1. It says, and a man from Bethlehem, we know his name now, Elimelech, in Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab with his wife and his two sons. So here's what he's faced with. This man from Bethlehem, the house of bread, they're now facing famine, and he's looking at the situation, maybe from an economic standpoint, maybe from a familial standpoint, maybe from a situational standpoint. He's saying, man, I have a responsibility to provide for my family. And by the way, I think this is another step of proof to prove that this was the judgment of God, because he goes to Moab, which is only 50 miles east of Bethlehem. In other words, 50 miles east, usually if there's a famine, it's going to last for 50 miles. He goes 50 miles away and there's no famine. What does that tell you? That it was the hand of God judging the people of Israel. The land of God, the people of God were judged. Moab was okay, 50 miles away. He has to make a decision. His decision, obviously, in this moment is, we're going to go to Moab. Moab is a place. Now, here's the problem. Now, I know we might look at this and say, no big deal. He was providing for his family. No big deal. He was saving his family from famine. He was going to provide for them. Maybe you would look at this and say, listen, there's upward mobility and job opportunity and strategic growth happening in Moab. I'm going there on a business deal because I'm going to provide bread for my family. Here's the problem. Moab was commanded by God not to mix with them. In fact, what's interesting back in Deuteronomy 23 is God told them, listen, not an Ammonite or a Moabite may enter the assembly of God. Don't connect with them. Here's why. Because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt. He says, listen, Moabites aren't good. Ammonites, do you remember when you came out of the land of Egypt? They didn't give you bread. They didn't welcome you into the land. And in fact, they turned their back on you. And remember, they were a part of the story of the judges. God used them for judgment. Don't go to Moab. It seems pretty clear that for the Jews, there was safety in the land of Israel. Don't leave the land and go out of that land outside. There's nothing for you. That was the idea from in the Old Testament for the Jews. It was, God gave you this land, stay in that land. From a Jewish perspective, there was no life outside of the promised land. No life outside of the promised land. Stay in the promised land. That's where life is. Even in famine, it would be better there than in the pagan hills of Moab. But this man makes a decision. He makes a decision that will affect everything in his family. In fact, he goes to Moab where they worship a false god named Kemosh. It's Kemosh is the name of their god. They worship this false god. If you read anything about, by the way, the Moabites, you know where they came from, right? Genesis 19 tells us that they came from an incestual relationship between Lot and his daughter. Remember that story? There was an incestual relationship between Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot's daughter, and they had a child, and they called the child Moab. That's where Moabites came from. Don't go there. Elimelech says, you know what, the famine is so bad, I need to provide for my family, and in spite of knowing maybe he didn't understand what God was saying, had said, because he had grown accustomed to the rest of the people, and just kind of did his thing, and he did what he thought was right in his own eyes, and he took his family and went to Moab. Now, you see what happens. By the way, I want to highlight some words, and I've circled them in my Bible because I want us to see the progression of his choice. Take a look at verse 1. It says, a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn. I circled the word sojourn. Sojourn has the idea of kind of like a foreigner. They're just passing through. They're just kind of coming through the land. Notice the end of verse 2. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. You go from sojourning to remaining there, and then you come to the end of verse 4, and it says they lived there about 10 years. Do you see the progression? First, we're just passing through. Now we need to stay for a while because the land's pretty good here. And all of a sudden, you find yourself living there. Folks, this is the pattern of sin. This is the pattern of sin all throughout the Scripture. Is first we begin to dabble and we think, I'm not going to let this take root of me. I'm not going to let this take over for me. And what happens? We begin to dabble, and then slowly we begin to remain there a little bit too long, and we can't get out, and we get ourselves stuck, and then slowly we find ourselves living in sin over and over again. This is the cycle that you and I face today. He made a decision to go there as a sojourner. They ended up remaining there, and slowly it progressed to they lived there. Same progression you and I have for sin. We slowly dabble with it, and slowly you will begin to live in sin. And as Romans says, why should we continue in sin if we have grace? Why should we continue in sin if grace abounds? Right? So this idea of living in sin, this progression. Now, this does not go well. And men, I think this is a warning to us as well as leaders of our families, that we are to be careful as to how we lead our families. The result of his decisions has major impact on his family. Now, we're going to see God's hand, and we're going to see the meaning behind facts. However, this decision was not a wise decision. And you and I, as men of our homes, better not be taking flight when times get difficult. We ought to be staying the course with the cause of Christ. And I think this is a warning to us. This is a little side note. This is a sermon within a sermon for you and I as men, that we are called to lead our families. I don't lead them to live in sin. I don't lead them to remain in sin. I lead them to righteousness. And here Elimelech makes a grave mistake. What looks like a smart decision becomes a grave mistake. And you and I, as men of God, as men leading our families, leading our wives, their future is dependent upon our leadership. Now, that's a scary thought, but I believe that's a reality here we see in the book of Ruth. We read on. Notice what happens. It says he had 2 sons. They went to Moab, but they remained there. Verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, does what? He dies. He makes a decision, and it leads to his death. Now, you and I may question, it doesn't tell us why he died, how he died. It doesn't say if it's old age. It doesn't say, the Lord doesn't reveal to us how he died. Was it because maybe they killed him? Was it because we just don't know? We're left with nothing. But he died. Isn't it interesting? He left a place because there was death and famine to go to a place of abundance, and what happened there? He dies. Do you see the irony of that? That his choice took his life. He went to a land to get food and health and prosper. He dies. The story doesn't stop there. We've already read it. You know what happens, right? It says, it says his two sons needed wives, so they took Moabite wives. By the way, this was also commanded against them in Scripture, not to take Moabite women because they were idol worshipers. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. By the way, second picture I see of God cursing them. And when I say God cursing, God disciplining them for going to this land. First of all, the father dies. Second of all, notice they lived there 10 years. And what is the most important thing to a Jewish man? Sons. Like in the Jewish culture, to have a son was everything. This man, Elimelech, had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, sick and dying. And you would have thought after dad dies, they would have, maybe they made a quick judgment call and said, hey, Dad, we need to marry some women because we need to carry on your name. If you may be dying, we got to carry on your name. And so we're going to get ourselves some wives. And he gave them the blessing to get Moabite women, which usually the father gives the blessing for the wives in the Jewish culture. And so here they are, and they say, hey, we're going to take some Moabite women. Fine, get yourself some wives and have some children. And notice here, they go 10 years, and where's the children? I think another point that draws us back to the fact that God is somehow holding something back from them because they are in sin, right? They're in a place that God did not want them, but God is going to use it. So he says there's 10 years and no children. And then notice what happens. The story goes even graver. It says they lived there about 10 years, verse 5, and both Mahlon and Chilion die. What? You got a family now with no offspring, a husband's dead, a father's dead, and now his two sons die. Think about it. First, we have a move to Moab. Second, we have marriages in Moab. Third, we have misery in Moab. And we see the desperation of this situation, and Elimelech's decision ultimately led to the destruction of his family. And notice the end of verse 5. So that the woman, Naomi, was left without her two sons, nor her husband. Here's a woman. She had nothing left. Nothing. She's got nothing. Doesn't have grandkids. What does she have left? And the question we want to ask is, how does she respond? Take a look at what happens. I mean, by the way, consider her family came to an end. There she was by herself in Moab with two Moabite wives. She's left penniless. She's left broke. She's left destitute. And that end of verse 5 says to us, listen, there's absolute devastation, absolute desolation, and absolute desperation in her situation. She's got nothing left. Verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and had given them food. Folks, this is a powerful statement here. The writer of the book of Ruth, we don't know who that is. No scholar does. Many believe it was Samuel, but no one actually knows. On two occasions, names the Lord for the cause of what happens. Everywhere else, you see the Lord mentioned 23 times through the book of Ruth. 23 times the name of the Lord is mentioned. That's, by the way, if you have your English, it has a capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And the reason for that is because that's the covenant name Yahweh. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The name Yahweh. And that's marked usually in our English with that type of spelling. Now here's what happens. They talk about the Lord all throughout this text, but it's always back and forth between characters. Back and forth. Ruth talking to Naomi, Naomi talking to Boaz, Boaz talking to Ruth. I mean, all these things going back and forth. But here's the thing. Only two places does the author of Ruth bring up the name of the Lord. It always had something to do, both times, with what God does. Here's one of them. God has visited his people and given them what? Food. In the chapter 4, we're going to see the name of the Lord show up again by the writer of Ruth, and it's going to say that God provides a baby. God provides food. In chapter 4, we're going to see a little note by the author of Ruth, and God provides a baby. You know the story, right? I mean, it's not like a mystery. By the way, you can go read it on your own. It's not like we're keeping it. You can't read it. It's a mystery novel. It's there for you. But that's where we see this name of the Lord mentioned by the author. He's pointing out that God is blessing. Now, watch what happens in devastation. She's returning. Verse 7. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Verse 8. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, listen, go return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of your husband, of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said, no, we will return with you to your people. And Naomi says, daughters, turn back. Why you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn, have hope. Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even I should have a husband this night and should bear sons. Would you therefore wait till they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She says, go back. Go back. By the way, this is not a very good missionary passage. Don't follow me to the true God. Go back to your pagan gods. That's what she's saying to them. She says, go back, leave. There's nothing I have of you. By the way, you notice the change. She starts positively and says, listen, there's hope for you. There's good things for you back in Moab. You can find husbands there. May God deal good with you. May he do well with you. And notice verse 11, how it all changes. The daughters say, no, we're going to follow you. We're going to your land. We're going with you, Naomi. And Naomi says, listen, I've got nothing. By the way, I always find this interesting. Whenever someone is in what looks to be a hopeless condition, we always exaggerate our hopelessness to an nth degree. We always turn the heat up of our hopelessness, and we live more hopeless because we're hopeless. Do you follow what I'm saying? No, you're not. Because I didn't even know what I just said. In Naomi's misery, she finds herself in this hopeless situation, and what does she do? She exaggerates it. She says, there's no hope. Listen, this is a law, by the way, in Deuteronomy 25 that says if your husband dies, you're married into the family, you can then be married to the next son of that woman, the mother-in-law. This is called and we're going to see this played out through the book of Ruth, what's called the kinsman redeemer, that someone in the family could then marry that woman and carry on the name of the father, of the original husband. And that was an Old Testament law that they had to allow the name to be carried on. And Naomi says, listen, I've got no husband. You're not getting any kids out of me. She said, I've got nothing to offer you. You go to my land with me, you are going to be looked at as an outcast. You're going to be widows for the rest of your life. There's no son that I have who will marry you. And besides, you're Moabites. Remember, Israel, the Jews don't like Moabites. Go back to your homeland. There's no hope. There's devastation. I mean, it's bad for me, and it's going to be bad for you. It's bitter for me, and it will be bitter for you. By the way, notice, I love that she says here, for the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Who does she attribute this problem from? The hand of the Lord has done this thing to me. She says this, God's nowhere around. He's done this. I'm left alone. I have no hope. And in her bitterness, she can't see a light, a glimmer of hope in this situation. And notice verse 14. They lifted up their voices and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and she left. But Ruth clung to her. The word there is a word that means like skin to bones. She held on to her mother-in-law. Now, we're going to see why she is holding on to her mother-in-law in the next phrases. And this is the most beautiful passage in all of the book of Ruth. It is the one that's most quoted. It's the one that's most known. Take a look at it. Here's what Ruth says, and we're almost finished. Verse 15, and she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth says, and listen to these words, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you will go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts from me. Now, we can skip over that. What a beautiful passage, but I want to tell you what's happening here in the Hebrew behind the scenes, all right? This is called poetry right here. It goes all of a sudden, it goes poetical on us. Now, most of Ruth is poetical. This goes poetical. Now, when you and I think of poetry in our English, most poetry has rhyme, right? So we say things like, roses are red, violets are blue. When I think of you, I go, woohoo. That's poetical. Men, it works. I'm telling you, if you're a single guy out there, that's how I got my wife right there. Baby rose of red, violets of blue. When I think of you, baby love, I go, woohoo. And I'm telling you, it's if you do it with that kind of baritone voice, women, the women, and my wife, I had her at that moment, all right? Now, we use, poetry has rhyme, doesn't it? It rhymes. In Hebrew poetry, it doesn't rhyme, because how do you rhyme? You can't rhyme that. Can't rhyme it. What they do is their poetry is based upon consonants or syllables. The amount of syllables you have in the first line, you have in the second line. The amount of syllables you have in the second line, you have in the third line. They're based upon syllables. And so here, we have a poetic structure in the Hebrew. Now, I'm going to explain this to you, and I'm not meaning to overwhelm you. I want you to see the beauty in this. Because the question is, why is Ruth clinging to her mother-in-law? The answer is given in what she says. It's called a chiasm. A chiasm is where you have 2 points that kind of begin and end, and they're the same. They're called synonymous statements. And then it works its way in like a pyramid to the middle statement. One statement that controls all others. Here's the chiasm. Take a look at this. This is the Hebrew structure of this passage. It says, Naomi says, listen, don't urge me to leave you. I'm going to follow you, Naomi. Notice point A at the end. Notice the text. It's right there. May the Lord do so to me and more also if anything but death comes my way. I am willing to die with you. First she says, listen, don't hinder me from following you. I'm willing to die with you. That's the last point of the passage. And then you can see how it goes in, where you will go, I will go. God, take me if it's necessary. All the way in. And notice point E. Point E is the central point of this chiasm in Hebrew. This is powerful if you see it. This is right there in the Hebrew. They understand this kind of poetical idea. And the central point of this poetical statement is, your God will be my God. Isn't there something interesting about why Ruth would follow a woman who is bitter? You ever hung out with a bitter woman before? Good answer. No. As you put your arm around your wife, no, dear, I never. It's your mom, right? No, I'm kidding. Not my mom, your mom. Okay, all right. No. Right. You dealt with a bitter person before? You don't want to spend time with them, do you? They've been journeying back to Bethlehem, and what happens? Here's this mother-in-law who's saying, listen, God's done this to me. I'm bitter. I can't do this. There's no hope for me. You at least have hope if you go back to Moab. I can't do this. What does Naomi see in Ruth? What does Ruth see in Naomi? Well, this chiastic structure tells us the reason is because God. That somehow she has seen something about the God. Now think about what Ruth has seen. Her husband has died. Her father-in-law has died. There was famine in the land. They've got abundance in Moab. And now this mother-in-law is saying we got to go back to the land where she's not going to be accepted. Why would she do that if it wasn't that she understood there is some hope in this God of the Jews? There's some hope in this God that Naomi wasn't even trusting in at this point. There's some hope. By the way, I find these statements interesting because you know what this means, don't you? Ruth was saying in this that I'm willing to die a widow. I'm willing to die childless. I'm willing to die in the land of God when I could go back to where it's easier. That I'm willing to go even to death to follow you, Naomi. By the way, I think this is pretty powerful because notice what Naomi says in verse 15 about Orpah. Orpah, why don't you go back with her to your gods? And Ruth says, no, I'm not going to my gods. Your God's going to be my God. I'm willing to die to know that God. And that is the reason we see Ruth clinging to Naomi, clinging to her. Think about that. This means death. This is, by the way, I've heard this passage. I've read this passage at weddings before. Couples will say, can you read this at my wedding? Where you will go, I will go. Where you will lodge, I will lodge. Right? This isn't a wedding passage. This is a cemetery passage. No, I'm serious. Isn't Ruth here saying, Naomi, I'm willing to go to your land where Moabites are not accepted, where no man will want me, and be a widow and childless because I realize there's some hope in your God. Your God will be my God. And Ruth realized that the only way to get to that God was through Naomi. Now, I'm sorry, if I'm trying to be God, that's a pretty poor way to do this. Hey, follow me. I'm a bitter woman. Come, know my God. Sorry, I don't want your God. somehow God has pricked Ruth's heart, and she's willing to cling to Naomi, knowing that that's the only way to the hope of God. Notice what happens, and then we'll be finished. Verse 19. I know that's the second time I've said it. We're almost done. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Maybe because there was a Moabite. Maybe they missed them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi? Sweetie pie. Is that you, sweetie?" Notice, she says to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara," which is bitter. The word bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" By the way, what do you think of Naomi's theology here? Naomi says there's three things. First of all, I believe God exists. Second of all, I believe God is sovereign. Third of all, I believe God's hands in all of this. Here she is not having hope in that God, but she sees three things that are absolutely reality in this situation. God exists, God is sovereign, and God has done this affliction. God has allowed this to happen. And she says, "The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now, I want to stop here, and I want to bring this back to our lives for a moment, and then we'll be finished. I want to apply this to us. The facts say one thing. It says there's devastation, there's desolation, there's destitution, and there's no hope. The facts say no hope. But what's the meaning behind the facts? What's happening behind the scene in our lives? And what's at work? Now listen, I believe this is ultimately the theme of the book of Ruth, which is the providence of God. Now when I say providence, I don't mean just some kind of weird theological term. I'm talking about this idea that God is providentially above all things. Providence has two directions to its meaning. Providence means he's sovereign and he's good. Now, why do I say that? Because some of you out here, I've talked to some of you, you'll say, well, why does God allow the Holocaust? Why did he allow the Holocaust? Why does he allow genocide in Africa? Why does God allow the sex slave trade to be so abundant in Thailand when we have missionaries working? Is God sovereign or is he not? The problem is you've just misaligned sovereignty. Sovereignty does not mean you do everything. Sovereignty means you know everything and that you rule over everything. That doesn't mean you cause everything. God never sins, never causes sin. You talk about what's happening around us in our land, in our area. You might talk about what is God doing behind the scenes. It's not caused by God. It is sin that causes this. God is sovereign, and God, his sovereignty is wrapped in his goodness. Do you not think that Naomi could have remembered the story of Joseph? She would have known the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph, a man who found himself in prison. And remember what it seems that man meant for evil, God meant for good. God is sovereign, but God's sovereignty is wrapped in his goodness. That we screw this thing up and the world is screwed up and so we have devastation, but God is working good in his sovereignty. Do you follow what I'm saying? He knows what's happening. He isn't necessarily causing all that's happened, but he's good in the background, working his plan of goodness and grace and mercy and blessing and hope. God is sovereign and he is good. And those two go hand in hand. God is not the author of confusion. God is good in the background. We just have to wait sometimes to see it. Remember Romans 8, right? God works all things together for good to those who love him and called according to purpose. So, hold on. The facts say, this is miserable, God. This is horrible, God. The meaning behind the facts is God's working together for good behind the scenes. God's doing a work behind the scenes to make himself glorious and known. God is making, and that is where we find our hope. The problem is we don't understand the meaning behind things, and we don't understand the meaning behind things, that our hope is weak. And Ruth somehow understood that this God was worth following even though there was no hope for her. Pretty powerful. Now, I just for a moment want to use these characters to ask you, how do you respond to the providence of God? It doesn't matter what the facts say. The question is, do you understand the meaning behind what's happening in your life? Like, all of us have a default mechanism that we run to. We all have a default button that we push. Let's take, for example, Elimelech. Elimelech leaves a famine and goes to a place of abundance, and he dies there. You know what he did? In a moment of crisis, what did he do? Elimelech ran. He didn't find his hope in God. He ran. He ran to living outside of the plan of God. Maybe you're here this morning and things start to get difficult. Things start to get tough. You see something that maybe is an irritation to you. And the question is, do you just run? Do you run? Do you run? Do you run to the things of Moab, so to speak, instead of the hope of God? Do you run to sinful patterns? Do you run to sinful tendencies? Do you run, what do you run to? Or maybe you're like Orpah. Orpah ran to her default mechanism. Her husband was dead. Where did she go? She said, I'm going back to comfort. Maybe for you, it could be a pattern or a habit. It could be, maybe you have a kind of a default mechanism that you run back to, and it's this habit that you have. You're not clinging to Christ. You cling to this habit. And you're wondering, God, why do I keep going through this cycle? Right? Most of us live in cycles. I call it, and you've heard me say this before, I've preached about this before, what I call the routine of life, right? It's not a routine, it becomes a routine, and you just keep going back in the rut, the same rut over and over and over and over and over again. Why? Because you're not finding hope in God. Your redemption is not based upon hope. It's based upon some facts of your life, and it's circumstantial. It's circumstantial. Or maybe you're like Naomi. You know what Naomi did? Naomi exaggerated her situation. Like there are some of you here, you love misery. And misery loves company. In fact, you thrive your life on drama. You look for the next drama to be a part of because somehow you define it. It's an excuse for your living, by the way. And some of you are like, man, you're being kind of wrong. Yeah, because I think that's what I see in Christians a lot, is we're waiting for the next drama to happen so that we can make an excuse as to why we're not living this way. And so we say, well, Pastor Dave, you don't understand what's happened in my life. I've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G happening, and I can't live that way because this is happening. What? And most of it you created. Naomi exaggerated her hopelessness. She exaggerated her situation. She didn't see the hand of God at work and didn't cling to God for sure. Now, she admitted it was God at work, but she didn't cling to him. And for some of you, maybe you're like Naomi. You misread the facts and you become self-absorbed. You become wrapped in your situation and you want everybody to talk about it. You want everybody to be wrapped in it with you. Do you not know what I'm going through? Right? You know what? You've seen it. You've done it. I've done it. And it's not really going well right now. And I know we ought to be honest with one another, bear one another's burdens. You know what that means? We also be honest with the others and say, maybe we ought to turn to Christ in this. Maybe we ought to find strength in Christ. We can sit around and mourn about it, or we can change it, right? That's hope. Or we respond like Ruth. That's Naomi. But what about Ruth? Ruth clung to her mother-in-law. And in that, the scripture says she was clinging to the fact that her God will be her God. Naomi's God would be her God. And you and I, like Ruth, are foreigners in this land. And the question is, where are we clinging? Are we clinging to Christ? Or are we clinging to other things? I just picture this, Ruth and Naomi, as they journey back to Bethlehem. You know what? They probably went through the same fields where 1,000 years later there will be shepherds keeping watch over the flock at night. The same fields they probably walked through. They came back to Bethlehem, right? The house of bread, the same town where 1,000 years later there was going to be a little baby born called the bread of life, who is going to be born in that town so that you and I would find satisfaction and hope. Bethlehem, a town known for bread, became famished. And 1,000 years later, there was going to be one who was going to be called the bread of life that comes from this little town to satisfy our hunger. Ruth understood something about this. She understood there was something worth going back to the house of bread. Hope is this. Here's what hope is. And as we look throughout the book of Ruth, we're going to see this. Hope is not confidence in your circumstance, right? Maybe you're here and you think convictions it's going to be better. Things are going to get better. Maybe you're here and you're saying, I have confidence this marriage is going to get better. I have confidence that my prodigal child is going to return. I have conviction that Mr. or Mrs. Right is out there for me. I have conviction, I have confidence in that. Or maybe you have conviction or confidence that the tumor is going to be gone, sickness will be over, depression will be lifted. Listen, if that is your hope, then I certainly hope it happens. Otherwise, your hope will be destroyed. Our hope cannot be in circumstances. Our hope cannot be in circumstances. Our hope has to be in a providence, the providence of a sovereign God who is good. Our hope has to be that there is a conviction of our hearts that God has not forsaken us, that God has not abandoned us based upon his character and his plan. It has nothing to do with circumstance, and it has everything to do with the character of God as revealed in the Scriptures. By the way, I want to read you the last phrase of this verse 22. Let's look at the last phrase and then we're finished. It says, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of what? Barley harvest. The God who brought famine in verse 6 brings harvest in verse 22. Hope is that I believe God's plan and God's character is better. Hope is I believe the character of God in the chaos of my life. I grab to the character of God. It recognizes that God acts before we do, and God reacts when I can't. I grab to that he takes the initiative in my life. That he, just like in this story, we have confidence he will bring the harvest in his timing in our lives. So are you clinging to Christ? Are you clinging to Christ? Remember years ago I did this ropes course. Ever been on a ropes course? And it was kind of high up, and we were doing this team building thing, and I was in college, and they called them RA, resident assistants. I was one of them, and get a little scholarship to help with money. And they took us to this rope course to kind of learn to respond to each other. And I remember they took us up really high, and they had us belted into this, kind of this, whatever they call it, a system, a belay system. And they had us in a harness. We had a helmet on, and we had to jump off this little podium and jump for like a swing rope, and then it would release, and you would swing while holding on. And I mean, it was like 50 feet in the air, 40 feet in the air, something like that. It felt like 100 feet in the air. It may have been, I don't know, 70 feet in the air, 80 feet, maybe 2,000, I don't know. When you're up that high, if you fall, you're dead, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how high it is, you're going to die. And so we were up there, and I remember standing up there, and everything in me was ready to jump, right? There's that exhilaration of, I'm going to jump, I'm ready. And I knew the harness. I trusted the harness, right? And you're telling your mind's playing tricks on you, saying, this is not what you're supposed to do. What are you thinking? This harness could break. The rope could break. The swing is not going to hold you. All these things. And I remember, you're sitting on the edge, and everybody's down below going, go, 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 right? And of course, some of them were girls too, so you had to jump, And I remember jumping out. I grabbed this swing, and I got it. And I started swinging back and forth, and I'm holding on. Everybody's cheering, right? And we kind of took turns. And of course, I was the weird kid that was like, I'll go first, because, everybody's watching. So I'd go first. And it got me down to the ground. And for some reason in my mind, I could not let go. My adrenaline was so pumped that I just kept hanging on. They're like, Dave, you can let go. You're on the ground. I'm sitting on the ground. And they're beginning to take the harness. I'm like, I can't. Like my mind, you ever have those moments where your mind is telling you, let go, but you can't. Like you can't. And I'm holding on, and they were like, Dave, you have to let go. And I was white knuckling this swing, even though I had been on the ground, because for some reason I was just in this mechanism mode. All right? That's the question of Ruth chapter 1. Is are we like Ruth, and when times get difficult, when life situations stink, when it seems sometimes hopeless and shattered, will we cling to the promise of God in the person of Jesus Christ? Will we cling to the bread of life who satisfies all hunger? Will we cling to the one who provides hope for us? And we know, as Romans 5 says, hope will never disappoint if it's in the right thing. Is that our hope? Is that what we're clinging to? Let's stand together as we pray this morning.